Before Melbourne's underworld wars made headlines, a quieter but far deadlier empire was rising in the city's west, led by Macchour Chaouk, an old-school crime boss who ruled through fear and family loyalty. The Chaouk clan controlled Brooklyn throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, linked by police to heroin trafficking, illegal firearms, and racketeering. They operated from a fortified stronghold known as the Fortress, raided countless times yet rarely cracked. What followed was a chain reaction of bloodshed. A fatal police raid in 2005, all-out war with the Haddara family, public shootings, and unsolved murders. By 2010, Melbourne had witnessed one of its most violent suburban feuds and the slow collapse of a criminal dynasty that once seemed untouchable. Part 1. The patriarch and the power vacuum 2 make sense of the chaos that followed. You first have to understand the man at the center of it, Macchour Chaouk. Macchour was never the flashy type. He wasn't a media-made figure like Carl Williams, and he didn't carry the polished image of the Carlton crew. He was old school to the core, quiet, intimidating, absolute in his control. After arriving in Australia from Lebanon, he settled in Melbourne's West, part of the city that, for years, felt invisible to everyone except those who lived and operated there by the late 90s and early 2000s. While Melbourne's attention was locked on the inner city, Underworld war, the stories later made famous by Underbelly, different battle was unfolding in the shadows out west. The Chaouk family was steadily building its name. Police intelligence linked them to heroin trafficking, illegal firearms, and racketeering. Yet despite the whispers and files piling up, they remained untouched. The reason was simple: family. The Chaouks ran a tight, insular operation. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was everything. Macchour sat firmly at the top, with his sons Mohammed Ali, Madid, and others acting as his inner circle. They didn't outsource violence. If something needed to be done, it stayed in the family. Their strength didn't start with sophisticated money trails. It started with land and control. Brooklyn was theirs. Anyone doing business there did so under their watch. The heavily fortified house on Old Geelong Road, known to police as the Fortress, was more than a home. It was a statement. Two rivals and law enforcement alike. It said one thing clearly: we're entrenched, and we're not backing down. But fear-based power has limits. It demands constant pressure to survive. And when power is enforced through intimidation, it inevitably draws challengers. Part 2. The spark of death in the family, every criminal. War has a breaking point, the moment where tension turns into open conflict. For the Chaouk family, that moment arrived on a cold morning in 2005. Police had chased the Chaouks for years. Multiple task forces tried to crack their operation. But witnesses suddenly forgot details, and evidence seemed to vanish at critical moments. Frustration inside Victoria Police was growing. Eventually, the Special Operations Group, the state's tactical unit, was called into act just after dawn. SOG officers stormed the Brooklyn Fortress. What followed was pure chaos. Armed officers flooded the house. In the confusion, Mohammed Chaouk, one of Macchour's sons, was alleged to have confronted police while holding a samurai sword. Seconds later, shots were fired. Mohammed was dead. That single moment changed everything. To the Chaouk family, this wasn't a police raid gone wrong. It was an execution. From that day forward, their hatred of law enforcement became personal and absolute. Macchour mourned his son publicly, but behind closed doors, something darker took hold. The family closed ranks. Security tightened. Weapons became more prominent. They no longer saw themselves as criminals under pressure. In their minds, they were targets of a corrupt system. That belief fed their paranoia and justified escalating violence. If police were willing to kill one of their own, then no one could be trusted. And while the family was consumed by grief and anger, another conflict far more brutal was already beginning to form just beyond their doorstep. Part 3. The War of the West, Chaouk versus Haddara. If you think the Hatfields and McCoys were ruthless, the feud between the Chaouks and the Haddaras makes that rivalry look tame. The Haddaras were another well-known Lebanese family operating in Melbourne's west. For years, both families existed in the same orbit-crossing paths, sharing connections, sometimes even tolerating each other. But as influence grew and pride got involved, cracks began to show. What started as small issues, verbal insults, brief confrontations, arguments over territories, slowly escalated. In a world ruled by ego and reputation, a single slight wasn't brushed off. It was remembered. And eventually, it demanded a response. This became known as the Western Suburbs War. It wasn't fought behind closed doors. There were no secret meetings or quiet negotiations. The violence played out in the open, on driveways, at traffic lights, and in local parks, right in front of ordinary people trying to live their lives. an atmosphere of terror picture living in Altona North during those years. Locals still talk about it. Automatic gunfire in broad daylight. Drive-by shootings so frequent that night walks stopped being an option. Cars went up in flames. Shop fronts and homes had windows blown out by shotgun blasts. Police were forced to step in with a dedicated unit. Task Force Santiago, created solely to contain the chaos. But even then, officers weren't really stopping the war. At best, they were trying to slow it down, acting more like referees than enforcers as two families tore the area apart. The murder of Mohammed Haddara, 2009. Everything escalated in June 2009. Mohammed Haddara, just 28 years old and a father, was shot dead outside his parents' home in Altona North. The hit was clean, deliberate, and unmistakably calculated. This wasn't random violence. It was an execution. Attention immediately turned to the Chaouks. The Haddara family was devastated and furious. Word on the street was simple. Retaliation was inevitable. But then the case took a shocking turn. A Chaouk associate, Ahmed Ablaz, walked into a police station and confessed to the murder. On the surface, it looked like the case was wrapped up, but it was anything but. In court, Ablaz suddenly withdrew his confession. He told the judge he'd been pressured into taking the blame and claimed the real shooter was Ali Chaouk, Macchour's son. According to Ablaz, fear drove everything. He said he'd been threatened and believed he had no choice. The court ultimately acquitted him. The murder of Mohammed Haddara remained officially unsolved for years. Lingering shadow over Melbourne's western suburbs, this was the height of the Chaouk family's infamy. Their name dominated headlines. They weren't just battling the Haddara anymore, they were also at war with the police. And for the first time, cracks were starting to show. Control was slipping, and the empire Macchour built was beginning to unravel. By 2010, the walls were closing in. Police were hitting the Brooklyn property again and again, sometimes weekly, pulling out firearms. Stacks of cash, even blank passports. It painted a clear picture. The family was under siege, and someone had been thinking about a way out that never came. Then came. Friday the 13th, August 2010, Mac, the man many believed was untouchable, was at home. Despite the ongoing war, the constant threats, and round-the-clock surveillance, he felt secure inside the fortress he'd spent decades reinforcing. He was in his backyard, possibly tending to the garden or simply taking a moment outside. Inside the house were his wife and grandchildren. What happened next took only seconds. A gunman got close to close. There was no forced entry, no chaotic rush through the front gate. Whoever it was knew the layout. Shots rang out. Macchour was struck in the chest and collapsed in his own backyard. Dying on the very ground, he believed, protected him from the world. Melbourne froze. The news spread fast. The King of the West was dead. Police flooded the area, not just to secure a crime scene, but to stop the city from tipping into lout revenge. Streets were sealed. Media crews poured in. Inside the family, grief turned instantly into fury. There was no waiting for answers. No official findings. The blame was immediate hand. It landed squarely on the Haddarus. With Macchour gone, an era ended. The family lost its tactician, its stabilizer, the one voice that kept order through fear and control. Without him, whatever discipline remained vanished. His sons were left angry, shattered, leaderless. Part 5. Justice served cold. The collapse of the Chaouk crime family didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece. After Macchour's death, fractures appeared almost immediately. Police pressed harder, sensing weakness. The pressure never eased. Matt Chaouk was later shot in a separate incident. He survived. But the message was clear: no one was safe anymore. Other brothers were dragged into court on weapons charges, violent offenses, and driving crimes. The Brooklyn fortress was raided so often it became a familiar headline. No longer shocking, just expected. But the final blow came years later. Tied back to the 2009 murder of Mohammed Haddara, investigators never let that case go. They knew Ahmed Hablaz's withdrawn confession mattered. Slowly, they rebuilt the case, turning witnesses, re-examining forensics, and filling in the gaps left behind. In 2018, almost 10 years after the shooting, Ali Chaouk finally faced trial. Prosecutors laid it out plainly. Ali was the shooter, the man who pulled the trigger to settle a long-running feud. Conclusion: the quiet streets of Brooklyn Drive. Along Old Geelong Road today, and on the surface, not much has changed. Trucks still crawl through traffic. Factories still buzz away, but the atmosphere is different. The house that was once known as the fortress no longer carries the fear it once did. The tension that hung over the street has faded. The story of the Chaouk family is tragic, but not in any glamorous way. It's a story of lives burned up chasing power and respect through violence. What began as control and loyalty slowly turned into paranoia, bloodshed, and loss. Every step deeper into that world stripped something away. They built walls to shut out enemies and authority, believing it would keep them safe. In the end, those walls couldn't stop the consequences coming from inside. Macchour Chaouk set out to create a dynasty. What he left behind instead were graves, prison sentences, and a family broken beyond repair. For people living in Melbourne's west, the collapse of the Chaouk Empire wasn't mourned. It was felt in the quiet. And after years of gunshots, sirens, and fear, that quiet was a relief, maybe even a blessing. Key takeaways for the audience. Why this story matters. It happened next door. This wasn't some distant underworld or a movie plot. This unfolded in ordinary suburbs where people grabbed groceries, walked their dogs, and took their kids to school. It's a reminder that organized crime doesn't live in shadows far away. Sometimes grows right beside everyday life. The myth of the code crime stories love to sell the idea of loyalty and silence. The Chaouk saga shows how fragile that myth really is. People talked. Confessions were made, then taken back. Fear outweighed loyalty when real prison time was on the line. The so-called code didn't survive pressure, the cost of feuds. The war between the Chaouks and the Haddaras proves one thing clearly. Revenge doesn't end anything. It only multiplies the damage. Sons were killed. Families were shattered. Futures were erased. There were no winners, only loss on both sides in the end. Melbourne's West paid the price for a feud that spiraled out of control. And the silence left behind tells the real story of how it finally ended.